So, welcome, Alon. And for the people who don't know you, could you introduce yourself and tell what are you doing and what is your job currently?
So my name's Alon Waisman, really just a guy who works in Salesforce. I'm not sure the best way to go about it, so I'll just give you like a 2-minute version of my life story. As a kid, I played a lot of video games. I went to college for business, nothing to do with computers or development. Uh, I got a job where I somehow did customer service and landed doing social media. Like I ran social media for a large company. I was the first person to tweet for them back in 2008. So I did that for like years and years. And then I lost that job because my whole team got dissolved. There's actually a funny story around getting laid off of that job. Anyway, so right around that time that I got laid off, found out that my wife at the time and I were having a baby, and we wanted to move. So we moved to a different state. I had no job. She had no job. And then figured I should do something more than like sell kitchen appliances, which is what I was doing to try to just stay afloat. So I went to a code school that so I live in Denver, and there's a code school in Denver which is pretty well regarded. So I went to that school. It's called Turing, if anyone is curious, like Alan Turing. Anyway, and so that was a career change for me when I was like 35 or 36. No, was it? Yeah, I was 36. So um, I went to a code school, and then my first job out of that was doing Salesforce. So that's how I landed working in Salesforce. Yeah, so I could expand that into a much larger story, but I'm going to stop there just so that you have the basic background. Um, eight years later, after getting my first job in Salesforce, I'm now still working in Salesforce, and architect is in my title, but I've been doing the same thing from day one to now. I just know more now than I did before.
How does it happen that after the boot camp, immediately you go into Salesforce development?
So uh, let me start. I want to have some context so I understand who I'm talking to. I know that the listeners will vary, right? But what is your background? Like, are you a Salesforce developer, or are you just someone who like is a groupie for Salesforce? What is?
Yeah, I am a Salesforce developer. I think I'm 4 years into Salesforce development itself.
Mhm.
I'm one of these kids who started coding in the school. And then I was born in Ukraine. And then I went to Germany to study computer science. And then during my university, I found Salesforce by just accident. And 4 years in, I am still in the Salesforce, but I kind of pivoted into teaching Apex instead of just being a developer, even though I still do development. But currently, I do like 90% of teaching instead of doing the development itself. But
This is going to
I have a
turn.
background. Yeah.
I was going to say this is going to quickly turn into me interviewing you because I have a ton of questions. But so okay, so I just wanted to establish that you're a developer, and so I kind of know what language I can use when speaking with you.
Totally
So
technical.
for
If you want to go technical, go technical. I love it.
okay, I all I want to say right now is that as a developer in Salesforce, and my experience is skewed to the United States. It may be different where you are, but I suspect it is relevant across the whole world, except in India. So Salesforce development is a very low supply, high demand environment. And this is what I tell, so I went back and trained Salesforce, like you do, to people who graduated from the same school as I did. I didn't do it formally, like I wasn't getting paid. I was just like, hey, give me a room and I'll teach people Salesforce. And so I would tell all these kids, I say kids, but they were all adults. I tell all these students, low supply, high demand environment. So as someone who just learned development, you're going to make more money working in Salesforce than you would, comparatively speaking, in some other language, just because there's fewer Salesforce developers. So anyway, with that sort of baseline, to answer your question, I fell into it just because some company needed it, and it's really hard to find developers. So my first job was at a company. They put fake teeth in people's heads, like permanently, and so they had a bunch of like dental offices or dental clinics. And so they had one Salesforce developer, and he was developing this whole, like before Health Cloud existed, he was basically developing Health Cloud specific to their business using Visualforce. And so he had moved into this very specific, very focused project to build this whole thing for like tens of clinics across the United States. And so they needed a new developer to come in and take care of all of the daily stuff. And when I use the word developer here, I mean administrator and developer, because if someone, if they needed a new user, I was also the person to create new users, or anything declarative. Like there was just the two of us, right? It wasn't like a whole shop of admins and devs. So I was the everything Salesforce person. And then my coworker, who had been there a while, he was off just working on this one project all day long for months and months and months. And by the way, it was amazing. Salesforce looked at it and said, "Oh my God, you should sell this. It's incredible." But so he built this really cool thing. And I came on because this company just needed a developer, couldn't find someone who wouldn't be exorbitantly expensive. So the great thing is a month after leaving this code school, I started this new job. I didn't even know that Salesforce existed in terms of like having a programming language. I had heard of Salesforce as a CRM. This, by the way, was in 2016. So I knew it existed, but I didn't know it was something you could program in. But of course, I quickly learned. The beauty there is that like my very first job at a code school, I was making almost 100 grand, US, which for me at the time was a whole lot of money. And I imagine for a lot of the people listening to this, it's the same experience.
Especially in Europe.
I mean, yeah, if you're coming from Europe, like Eastern Europe, sure, it's going to be a lot. Germany, I don't know how it compares. But anyway, I felt like finally I was able to take care of my family, because I got this job right out of code school, and I just from that moment forward, I was like, this is great. Salesforce pays me a bunch of money. Like, there's no reason to leave and go work in some other language. Plus, anyway, that's not my style. I'm gonna shut up though. Like I told you earlier before we even started recording, I can just ramble forever. So I'm gonna stop and let you move on.
You mentioned an interesting thing. So low supply, high demand. Do you think it's still true? Because now a lot of people complain that they can't find a job.
So it certainly has become more difficult because of all the tech layoffs that have happened. I mean, when Salesforce itself lays off thousands of people, of course, there's going to be a glut in the market. I think that's especially true for admins. And I'm fairly active in the local Salesforce community. And my coworker, I just changed jobs 2 months ago, but for like 2 years, I worked at another company doing Salesforce where I was the only developer, and I had one, additional Salesforce person who was our admin and business analyst guy. Anyway, he's great. He's a friend of mine now. And he heads up the local like Salesforce admin group. And so he put on our local Denver Dreaming event. Through him, I've stayed connected to the local community, and we have a lot of admins who are like people who have learned that, hey, Salesforce is a place you can go, or like an ecosystem you can get involved in and get a job that makes really good money with no experience. And that was totally true several years ago. And now we've got a lot of these people who've learned that. And it's not just in Denver. I just use Denver as an example because it's where I meet people in person. But if you go on Reddit, you see the same thing. Like admins are just talking about, hey, I got my admin cert and I can't get a job, and it's been months. So I think that's definitely true, because the barrier to entry for Salesforce administration is really low. It's definitely anyone can do it with a little bit of study thing. And I want to be careful about what I say here, because I think anyone can do development as well. But I think people are more scared of development. And a lot of people don't believe what I believe, that anyone can do development. So they don't,
Wh-
dip their foot into learning coding. And that means it's a much
Why do you
smaller
think?
pool of people.
Sorry for interrupting. Why do you think
Yeah.
it's the case that a lot of people don't believe in development, especially?
I don't think it's that they don't believe it. I think they're just a low self-esteem. There's all sorts of people who believe, I'm not good at math, I'm not good at science, I just don't think that way. They make excuses for themselves, thinking that they're not able. And I mentioned that I came up from the school called Turing. I don't know that it's like their motto or anything, but definitely the feeling when you're there at Turing is that absolutely anybody can learn to code. I went before COVID, and that means I was in class with people like in person, meeting them, talking to them. Now it's all online. They've switched to remote only learning, so it's a different experience. But um, I was physically in class with someone who was a railroad conductor. Like he drove trains and then he went into coding and he's been very successful. There were, elementary school teachers. We had professional sports players, people who had played, like, I think we had at least one professional baseball player and maybe also a hockey player. People who did construction, every walk of life. People would go to this school and they would study exactly the same curriculum that I studied. And now I come from a background, I was nerdy. I took some coding in high school. I took some coding in college. I didn't go into computer science specifically, but like I think my minor in college was computer information systems, right? So I wasn't foreign to the world of geekery and computers and all that. So personally, I think I have a leg up. Like it comes to me more naturally than it may come to other people. But I firmly believe that anyone can learn it, just like you learn a spoken language, just like you learn a written language. We're all capable, and it might just take some effort and some study, but it's scary, right? If you don't have that natural aptitude, if you don't feel like you have the natural aptitude, that's even more important. Whether or not you have it is kind of irrelevant. Whether or not you believe you have it or you believe you're capable is really really the key point here. On top of that, I also think you need a capable tutor. You need someone to teach you. And the school I went to, they did a really good job. Again, I came from a background where I already knew programming techniques. I already knew like what a variable was and what a method was and how you pass these things between each other. Like, so I didn't have to learn the basics because I came in already knowing it. But programming is scary to a lot of people. And so it was a very long answer to your question of why don't people get into it? And it's just scary to them. And hopefully people like you and I, it shouldn't be scary. It should just be something you put some effort into.
I think about it a lot because a lot of people, because I'm teaching, it's like literally written on my LinkedIn profile that I'm teaching Apex to senior admins. And a lot of people go to me and ask, so like, can anyone be a developer? Can I be a developer? And I'm like, well, that kind of yes, but also kind of no. You can be developer or not, depends much more on your what do you think about it, if you can or not, rather than on your abilities, because there's nothing magical about coding. It's just a skill that you learn, and at some point it gets quite repeatable. At some point you see a problem and you immediately know how to solve it because you just have solved it so many times and you know this algorithmic thinking. And a lot of people still don't see coding as just a skill, just a job, because for some reason, I don't know, the coding on the internet has this magical aura that developers are somehow special, something like this, and you need to be born that way, or you need to have a talent to become a developer. But I think it's just pure motivation, and whenever you can be developer or not just depends, do you have enough motivation, and are you willing to sacrifice enough time to become a developer?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. However, I'll throw in the extra piece that you need to have a good teacher. Now, there's a lot of solutions out there for learning online where you're not working with another human being. We hear about how people learn differently. Some people, are auditory learners or visual learners, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, coding is definitely weird, right? Like when you're just a human walking in the real world, and then you have to think in a way that is necessary to program a computer, you have to adjust your thinking a little bit. And there's a lot of concepts that are not necessarily natural, which is strange because to me this stuff all seems natural because I'm probably autistic and I feel like I'm a robot on a daily basis. But certainly some of the concepts, they take good explanation, and there are a lot of people who teach who suck at teaching. Like it's much more difficult, I think, to be a teacher of something than to do the thing that you're teaching. um, because once you learn how to do a thing, like if you know it, doing it is easy, right? But to be able to teach it, you need to truly understand it. And you need to also understand the person you're working with. So there's two facets to it, right? Like I can just spit out how coding works, but if the person I'm working with, their eyes just glaze over and I can tell that they don't know what the heck I'm talking about. I need to, one, be able to recognize that, right? Which is in itself a skill that takes emotional intelligence beyond just technical intelligence. And then I need to try to understand how I can convey the same teaching moment, how I can convey the same material to them in a way that they would understand. I personally think I'm a pretty good teacher. I've been told I am, but who knows? Like, I don't think I have a huge sample size, but it's really important, I think, to, if you're going to be a developer, that you have someone who can teach you well. And that's super difficult to find, right? Like, because tutorials only go so far. But I do think that's why when there's good material on the internet, like, word spreads fast. Like, hey, go here, this place does it well. Learn from these tutorials or from this project. And there's not very many of them out there. So the few that do exist, I think, get spread around pretty well.
Yeah, this is so that resonates so much with me because when I started teaching, I was surprised by actually how much I don't know. At some point, when you work 3-4 years as a developer, you don't think about iterating through a map, for example, or iterating through a list, and you're like, it is how it is what it is. This is how it works. And then when you have to explain the concept, you're like, oh, wait a second. So there are so much nuance to what we are doing as a developers. So definitely resonates with what you talk.
Yeah. Do you find that do you believe that you are a better developer now because you have taught other people how to do the same thing you already knew how to do?
I think I'm better at the concepts that I teach. It doesn't make me much better the developer because I'm definitely to some degree better, but in a very weird way. I kind of have more mindfulness around the code, and I appreciate much more the way code written, because as developer it's easy to forget. You just write code, you have the task, you spin off the code, you deliver solutions, but actually it's like a lot of stuff that goes into this. So in a weird way, I'm definitely better as a developer, but in a little bit strange way.
Yeah. So I think I definitely am, and for a number of reasons. Like, so, I was teaching this class at my school, and there was a period of time when I was teaching it pretty consistently. I would just spend about 4 weeks with people, but then, every time there was a new class coming out of my school, which happened every 7 weeks, I would take on a group of people and I would teach them. And I sort of had the same curriculum over and over because, you know, you come up with something that you think works and you just do it. So I would, for instance, there was a day where I taught triggers, and we would write a trigger to do a certain thing. And so explaining these concepts over and over repeatedly helped me when it came time to do my own, in the real world, developing for my own job later. Like, it made me faster and it made me understand it better. And that's just one example. But other examples are, like, I live with my partner. She is a more junior Salesforce developer. She only started, like, a year or so ago. And so I would help her with some of the work that she was doing. I would see, the code, the classes that she's working in, and she worked in a very different environment than me. This is going to be a tangent for a second, but I said that I've worked where I'm just like one developer on, and there's no other developers in my company, right? Or where there were only two developers. That's always how it's been. I've never worked at a company with more than one other Salesforce developer. I think the most Salesforce people I ever had was my second company, and there were like 3 admins, and I was the only developer. Now, my girlfriend's company, where she was, she's not there anymore, but where she was, there were like teams of junior developers, several, like probably tens of people doing Salesforce development. And so hands were in pots left and right. Different people worked on different parts of code. And because they were all juniors, the code all sucked. Like, the code base for this company that I'm obviously not going to say the name of is absolute trash. And I know this because I would see it. And she would be given a small task to, make a small change or to fix a problem. And I was like, okay, well, if you want to do what you say you want to do, like if you want to do what the stakeholder wants, looking at this code, like, you can't just change 2 lines. We need to deconstruct this entire thing and rebuild it because it's all junk. And in doing that, like in helping her through that process, I would explain just general theories, like, okay, let's separate this content into more methods. Let's move the data over this way. And by the way, I would get it wrong all the time. Like, I would backtrack. I'd say, here, do this, do this, do this. Actually, you know what? It might be better if we do this. And then we would talk about it. It's like, well, why? Why do we want to do it this way? Why do we want to? I don't have good examples to give right now, but, like, why do we want to put this SQL query at the beginning and pull certain data so that we don't have to do more below? Or why do we want to collect a certain data set up here and translate it into, let's say, like into a custom class, and then use this further down below? And there were just, the point I'm making is that I would spout out concepts. I'd be like, the better way to do this is, do it this way and this way and this way. And I think I would feel a greater responsibility to do it the quote correct way, or at least a good way, when I'm teaching someone else. Whereas if I was writing my own code in my own company that had no code review because I was the only person doing it, maybe I would have less discipline because I didn't have anybody to judge me. And so by teaching back to someone and saying, okay, well, best practice really is you should do this, and then this, and then this. A simple example is, don't write a large method, separate it into lots of smaller methods. The more separation you can do, the better. It creates these levels of abstraction, and you can move the data around easier. And anyway, because I had so many experiences teaching people this is how you should do it, when it came time for me to do it myself, I would have like my own speeches in the back of my head, like, this is the right way to do it. So I was like, okay, great. Even if it takes me an extra second, I'm gonna do it the right way, because even though I'm the only developer in my company, I know that eventually I'm going to be gone. Someone's going to come in and look at this. And I don't want to be the asshole that left them crappy code. I want to leave things in a good state so that they can take them on years to come and do a good job. Not to mention so that I can take it on in 2 weeks after I will have forgotten everything that I did and still be able to manage it. So I often will code well just to speak to my future self and do a good job. But anyway, this all stems from my question of do you think you're a better developer after having taught? And I was explaining that yes, I think I am, because I would force myself to adhere to the standards that I asked my students to adhere to.
What I read here from what you say is that it's important not to only watch Udemy courses or watch YouTube videos, but also find someone who you can actually human to human communication, where you can have one-to-one, or who can give you personalized feedback. Do you think it's possible to be a good developer without having that?
I mean, let me answer that in 2 ways. I think the simple answer is, so I'm really literal. Your question is, can you be a good developer without it? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, you can. The problem is it's going to take longer to get there. So
Mhm.
I think I'm a good developer. There's a lot I don't know. But what I do, I think I do reasonably well. And I'm 8 years in, but I'm very aware of the fact that where I was after 5 years, I could have been after like a year and a half if I had a proper mentor, someone showing me how to do things better than I was doing them. Here's a great example. All right, so I was completely self-taught in Salesforce, right? I started at that first company that I mentioned before, and I had there was this one other developer. So if I had a bug, like I couldn't get past, something was breaking, I could ask him, hey, can you take a look at this? And he would dig through the logs and figure out why I was having a problem and answer it for me. But like, we never pair programmed. We never worked on problems together. He never gave me advice. He would give me like, yep, this is why it's broken. That's it. Like, that's the feedback I would get. And I left that company after 14 months. When I left, I helped them find my replacement. So I stayed on, when I put in my notice, I stayed on for a full month, which is a lot, at least in the United States. And so we spent 2 weeks finding a replacement from the same school that I came from. And then I had 2 weeks to train that person. And for whatever reason, I just remember this one story very clearly. I was showing him my code, teaching him some stuff. And I don't know why, but the senior developer who was my coworker at the time, not the new guy, but the older guy who was working on that special project, I must have asked him how to do something. And he was like, oh, well, you can just do it this way. And that thing, which to you, I hope is going to sound super basic, and to me now sounds super basic, is that for a whole year, I was writing Apex code, writing SQL queries all the time. And I didn't know that you could bring child records into a SQL query. I didn't know that you could do a sub select or whatever that's called, where, pull in all of the accounts and the opportunities that belong to those accounts, right? I just didn't know you could. I thought I had to get the accounts and then get opportunities and then put them all together with whatever post-processing I need to do, because I just didn't know that that syntax existed. Now, I taught the new guy because he'd only been there 2 weeks with me. So in his first 2 weeks, he knew that you could pull child records in a SOQL query. But for me, it took 14 months to learn. And so you can become much better if you have someone mentoring you for specific things, like just syntactical things. You didn't know you could do this? Guess what? You can. But also, what I think are more important things of just like, this is how you should think about the code. This is how you should attack a problem. Right? Break it up into chunks in this way. Think about governor limits in the case of Salesforce, where governor limits are a thing. There's so many. I'm not going to go into specifics. There's a million different things to learn. And if you have someone guiding you, teaching you those things right off the bat, then great. And my whole thing when teaching people is like, maybe today we're going to talk for 3 hours during our training session. And I'm going to teach you so many things. They are not going to stick in your head. But what is going to stick is just the idea. Like, oh, I know that's possible. I don't know how to do it. Maybe I don't remember the syntax for pulling child records into my SOQL query, but I know it can be done. So then I can just ask the internet how to do this thing. And so if I can just put the seed of knowledge into someone's head while training them, then they can take it from there to teach themselves through repetition. Like if they find the same Stack Overflow message 5 times, eventually they'll just remember it. And yeah, so I think you're a lot better with someone actually teaching you.
I think the most influential time in my career was actually when I was working in the beginning, shoulder to shoulder, one to one with the senior developer. And I just can't imagine how much quicker how much I learned in those 6-8 months that I worked with the senior developer, and how long would it me take if I didn't have this developer. So I think it's super important to have someone. Not even it should not be someone who are you interacting every day, but at least once a week or once every couple of weeks, but someone who has the experience how to give you this kind of knowledge. Because even though we're super digital people, but we are still learning from each other, and the best learning we get is just through human interaction.
Yeah, I mean, there's more to it too. Right? This is a point that I had in my head and I didn't say. So, I mean, if you want to go build muscles or whatever, you have a physical trainer, right? And or you can get a physical trainer, and that trainer is there to motivate you, right? But also to teach you. So, like, they might take you to a certain exercise machine and tell you hold your arms or your legs in this position, use the machine like this. Be careful not to do this. Do it in another way where maybe you hurt yourself, right? So they can teach you the technical aspects, but at the same time, they're just standing there saying like, hey, do it, you can do it. And I don't need to get all mushy and be like, it's just the emotional support. That's, I think, an important piece of it too. But when we're learning code development, one thing I don't like is that when you're learning through a tutorial, the tutorial steps you through every piece of it, right? They're like, all right, we're going to learn this new thing, do this, do this, do this. Oftentimes, at least it used to be, in a Salesforce tutorial, it would be like, here's a bunch of code, copy this and paste it in to a new class. You're like, how is that teaching me anything? You're just giving me this code and I paste it. I don't know how it works. I don't know any of the features of this code. You just told me to paste it in and suddenly something works. And that's useless. And when you have a developer like myself or you or whoever, like we can say, hey, let's go over some concepts. I'm going to teach you some things. Here's how to do this in the code, right? Now let's work on a project. I'm going to give you an idea for, let's say, a Lightning Web component. This Lightning Web component is going to require a very small amount of Apex code, but you'll need to do it. And so, it'll involve an Apex class. It'll involve, obviously, the front end, so the HTML part. It'll involve accepting variables from the admin through the metadata file. It'll involve some JavaScript. Like, these are the components. These are all components you've learned. Now, let me give you an idea. I want you to build something that does X, right? Go work on it without me. There's no tutorial telling you what steps to take. There's nothing except all of the learning you've already done. And then come back to me next week. Tell me where you've gotten. And the benefit of doing it this way is that it forces you to think on your own. Right? When I was a kid, I hated homework in school. But the truth is that reinforcing concepts is super important to learning. So when I tell a student to go back and just work on a project without me, they struggle and they'll take 5 hours to do something that I could just just do this. Tap, 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 it's done, right? In 2 seconds. But they'll take 5 hours struggling through it and come back to me, and maybe they made 10% progress, maybe. on this project. I was like, okay, great. And like, you made it this far, you learned a bunch. Now those 5 hours of struggle are like built into your brain. Now let me help you get past the hurdle where you couldn't get past because you just eventually you got to give up for your own sanity. So this is how you do that thing you couldn't solve. All right. And then let's talk about what I think comes next. Now that you've done this, you're going to need to think about, how would you do X, Y, and Z to solve the next part of this problem? Let's talk a little bit. Cool. Go back on your own. We'll come back in a week again together and I'll see where you got to again. And that's sort of one like emotional accountability of knowing that someone's going to come back and give you some amount of judgment. They'll be kind about it, hopefully, but they'll be looking at your stuff. And so you feel accountable to them. In addition, they're not holding your hand the whole way. They're asking you to do it on your own. And they'll push you through it if you don't get there. But doing it on your own is really vital part to, what's the word I'm looking for? Like to rooting it in your brain, like really getting it to stick so that you don't need notes anymore. Like I find it weird when I teach people, they're taking notes and whatever. Like some people love taking notes, but I swear to you, I've almost never in my life taken notes for coding and referenced those notes later. Right? I've never been like, oh, let me go back to page 6 where I wrote that thing down. It'll answer the question. Right? I never do that. And I guess other people do. Maybe I'm just a special butterfly or something, but I find it so strange. And if
It's
you work on
definitely
this stuff, I repeat myself a lot. I was just saying, like, when you work on it for 5 hours and you know all the stuff you did because you struggled through it, you're going to remember it. You're not going to need your notes anymore. And the struggle, personal development piece is just really key to your long-term success.
Yeah, I also never took some notes, and I think people feel the need when they see the syntax. They feel the need that they want kind of memorize it sometimes, and that's where you have to no, this is like you will memorize it by just doing. And when you didn't memorize the word table, for example, in English, you just kind of internalized it in your head that this is the table. And the same happens with programming. Do you think that the same frameworks with mentoring applies for switching from senior developer to the architect? This is what I want to talk about. And this is the path that I started, but I didn't finish this path. Going from developer to the architect. What do people need? And what's missing for developers to go this path?
I know I have architect in my title, and you brought me on to probably answer that question. But I don't know that I have an answer. I'm definitely gonna give you one of my long speeches. So my first job was developer. The job I had previous to this one was also, whatever, senior developer or something. Means nothing to me. But at some point I told my boss, I was like, hey, can we make my title architect? And he was pushing back on me a little just to like be annoying. I was like, no, I don't need any more money. I'm not looking for a raise or anything. Just like put architect in my title because eventually I'm gonna leave this company and apparently people want that in your title. But I didn't do anything different when I went from developer to architect. And I can tell you what, when I started my very first job, I was doing the same stuff. And I said this at the beginning of our talk today. My very first job at that company that put teeth in people's heads, and I was just developer, I did the same stuff there as I'm doing now, as I think I'm principal enterprise solutions architect or something. Like it's just a bunch of fancy words that all mean the same thing. And I think I'm lucky in that respect in terms of the jobs that I had. And so we need to recognize the difference in tasks associated with these roles and how they blend at different companies. What I mean by that is let's separate Salesforce work into the 3 classic roles: admin, developer, and architect. An admin, you'd say, okay, you're the person who knows how to like make users and add fields and add tables and put in some declarative automation using flows or process builders if you're old school or whatever. But you don't know develop, probably. And then if you're a developer, you know development. Great. Now you can work at a company like the one I described my partner worked at. There are teams of junior developers. They have, of course, because they have teams of people doing this, they also have project managers. So they have this management level layer that takes in the projects and talks to the stakeholders and decides, is this development work? Is this administrator work? Who should this go to? And also they will design the solution to some degree. So they'll take in the stakeholders' request and say, okay, to solve this, we need to change code in this class, right? In some trigger handler class. We need to go in there, find this method, and change the code. Now, in my opinion, they just did 90% of the work. They could have taken the extra 10 minutes to write the code and save it, and the job would be done. But instead, they pass that off to some developer and say, okay, I'm going to spend half an hour with you talking to you about what the stakeholder wants, why we have to do it this way, go into the code, make this change. And then the developer probably takes, 3 hours because they don't really know what they're doing because they're junior. They make the change, they test the change. I mean, if they're worth anything, they test the change. And then they work with the stakeholder maybe to make sure that it solves their problem. There's all of these layers that are super inefficient, in my opinion. And in that style, you can have someone who is just a developer and someone who is just an admin and someone else who is just the management/architect. Now, that's in a company that has all of these different roles and different people in those different roles. So in my first role, I went into this company where there was one other developer and zero admin. So then I became the admin developer architect. And my boss would just say, hey, Susie from marketing wants to be able to do this thing. Can you help her build something that will do what she wants? And I was like, yeah, let me go talk to Susie. So I talk to Susie, she explains what she needs, and I add some new fields. I change some page layouts. I write a little bit of code. Back then I was in a place that was, it was still in Classic, so everything was Visual Force or triggers or whatever. And so my job was to work with the stakeholder and figure out my boss at that job, he would say, people come to you saying that they need a drill, but what they really need is a hole. I've used this analogy when I've taught people like so much over my life. Like they'll come to you saying, hey, I want a field that, has these 3 values in it. And you're like, hold on. I think what you really need is to just have a list view that shows you what you want, right? And I don't think this field is going to solve it for you. You can just put a filter on your field that you didn't know you could do, and that solves your problem without a new field or without a new formula or without code, right? So that's what he meant. Like people tell you they need a drill, really they need a hole, and you need to figure out how to put that hole in the wall. It might be a drill, it might be a nail, it might be some other tool. So my job was to do all of the pieces, even though I had just started, like a month into working for this company. I'd never seen Salesforce before, and I'm talking to stakeholders. I'm designing the solution. A month in, I wasn't writing any code. I hadn't learned the code base enough yet, but I was designing the solution. And that's the same from then, when I started until now. The project that I'm, just about to go live with at my new company, nobody uses Salesforce yet. I came into this company, I'm the building, implementing Salesforce from the ground up. And it was exactly the same thing. I talked to the stakeholders to understand what their problem was, not what they were asking for, just understand what their problem is, look at how they're currently solving it, figure out how I could solve that better using Salesforce to understand all of the pain points and all of the problems that would be solved by transitioning this task from where it was, before to where it will be in Salesforce. I had to write code. I had to build flows. I had to create fields. I had to manage permissions. I had to decide, am I going to use profiles or permission sets, which is, the new thing, which I have mixed feelings about, right? So I had to do all of those things. And so I have architect in my name, but I'm also developer. I'm also admin. And unfortunately, at least for you, looking for an answer to your question, I've always been an architect, even if it hasn't been in my title. I don't know any different. And I think, it's the only experience I have. I think that's the better solution. It's one person who understands all of the pieces and does it all. Now, it's not realistic in a larger company where you have to get more work done, so you can't have one person who knows everything. But I think the person who talks to the stakeholder and understands the need, if they're also the person doing the work, it's so much more efficient because there isn't anything lost in translation. And if someone needs to pivot, if they need to make a transition and be like, hey, you know what, I talked to the stakeholder, I designed this solution, but you know what? I just thought of a better solution. I think I could do it this way instead of that way. Then I can just make the decision and I can just do it. But again, as an example, in my partner's company, if her boss told her to do it in a certain way, she was very reluctant to change the solution. But I'd talk to her and I'd be like, no, he suggested you do it this way, but why don't you go back to him and say, hey, we should do it this way. It's better for this reason and this reason and this reason. There's no downside. And so when you have all those layers act as gatekeepers. It leads to worse solutions, at least in my imagination. I've never worked in that environment, so I can't it's harder for me to give specific examples to prove that I'm right. But I think having someone who does all the pieces allows it to be much more flexible. And as long as they're good, it could be a good solution. The downside is if they're bad or inexperienced, right, is the equivalent here. If they're inexperienced, maybe they'll come up with a bad solution. And so having multiple layers in there where experts are involved, helping to guide is also helpful. At this point, I've rambled on. I want you to restate your question again about architects and pathing.
Basically, I was curious about the change from developer to architect, but I think I agree a lot on what you say, because I think that what makes a good developer is actually that good developers think a lot about architectures, and good developers, they are also architects. It's just that in the beginning you don't have that much of exposure and you don't understand a lot of parts of the system and how they work together. So you don't have the overview to create a clean, good architecture or to see some long-term implications in what you write. But in general, the more experience you get, the more of an architect you become. The question is, what do you enjoy more? Because I think if you go and have the title of architect, people have a totally different expectation of architects versus developer, because as a developer you can steer your career into, for example, almost not having any meetings, or just basically writing code, and be I don't know, completely in your room and have as little meetings as possible. And in general, I think when you switch into architect, or when you take on the architect role, you're kind of expected to have much more people responsibility, much more um, talking to stakeholders and all that stuff. But still, you cannot be a good developer without being a good architect.
I think you're going to be better, yeah, if you have those other skills. And what's strange is what you just said, it implies that there are people who want that. They want the developer lifestyle of not ever having meetings, right? And that's so weird to me. As much as I consider myself, a basement dweller, and so my personality is such that I want to know all of the pieces. So if someone comes to me, if I was just a developer and they say, "Hey, we need to, build something that does this," I would really want to understand why. And I think part of that is because I'm an asshole, right? Part of it is me saying, like, well, maybe what you're suggesting to me is not the best solution. And I need to figure out what this is actually doing, because maybe I can come up with a better solution than you. Right. So that's what I mean. Like, it's like, no, you're wrong. I could do it better. And I've asked so many people, why they went into development or why they like development. And the answer that everybody gives, and I'm not faulting them, I give the same answer. But the answer we all give is we like to solve puzzles, right? Every developer, it's the same answer. And how, like, the puzzle part is talking to the person and understanding the problem, the real problem, and figuring out how to solve it. And code is sometimes the solution and sometimes it's not. In my experience in Salesforce, it almost never is the only solution. It's part of a larger solution. And talking to the stakeholders, i.e., having meetings, that's also the good part, because you build something and then they're happy, right? And we all want that positive reinforcement of someone, giving us kudos, just saying good job, like, I like what you did. And if you're a developer in that other kind of environment, then it's like your boss is like, all right, good job, here's the next ticket. I feel like there's going to be less appreciation directly attributed to you for the work that's done. And as much as I like to think of myself as not like stupid Generation X or Y or whatever it is that constantly needs approval, we all enjoy that. We all like to see that our work is well received, and you know supporting the company and actually providing some value. So I just can't imagine being in that position where I wouldn't want to have meetings. I don't want my life to be meetings, right? I want to actually get some work done, but I want to also have that face to face to know that what I'm doing is good, and to understand what's being done. That's what I was complaining about, the inefficiency of layers, right? If I build a project and I communicate it to my manager, of course that manager is not going to fully understand what I just built, because you could build something that's hundreds of lines of code. They're not going to go over it with a fine-tooth comb and understand every little piece of it when they talk to the stakeholder. I mean, the manager is probably not even a developer, and so he'll talk to the stakeholder and be like, "Hey, she built this thing that does this and this and that," and then the stakeholder will say, "Oh, that's cool. Could it also do this?" And then the manager goes back to the developer and tells them, "Hey, can you add this piece in?" And they're like, "Well, but first of all, if I knew that they might want that before, then maybe I would have architected the solution differently. If I was the one talking to the stakeholder, I might have immediately thought, hey, do you think you're going to want this extra piece? Because it makes sense to me that if you want this, you also want that. And so I can help drive a better solution by being the person who communicates with the stakeholder. And I hate, obviously I've driven this point home. I hate the solution that has someone in between the worker and the stakeholder. Those environments, I think, are not ways that produce good solutions.
I agree. So I worked the last 4 years in consulting, and in consulting, it's such a common practice where you put onto quite a lot of different projects, and then you have like consultants that go and speak to the client, and then you're as developer, you get some requirements, and then you're like, wait a second, so this requirement is not complete at all. Let me talk to the client, and then you go talk to the client, and then it starts back and forth. It's definitely quite inefficient. But going back to the coding or like having meetings, I've met very few people who actually enjoy the coding itself. Like
Yeah.
not solving the problem, but the process of coding itself. And they were excellent in coding. Like if you give them some task, develop this and this LWC, develop this and this trigger, they will do it perfectly and they're gonna love it. But I think it's very rare because as for you, and I think for 99% of people, I don't enjoy the coding itself. I enjoy solving problems and building stuff. And coding is just kind of a tool that you use.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, obviously I only live inside my own brain. I don't live inside other people's heads. So I don't know, but I do enjoy it. And I'm trying to think of a good analogy, right? Like,
You enjoy the coding itself, the
yeah,
process of
and
writing code.
let me yeah, and let me imagine a different scenario. Let me imagine the world where I am the architect. And here's the thing. I got to say, you asked me about, path to architect. I've been doing this for 8 years, but it's always been in these tiny microcosms, like I said, one or two developers. I don't know what it means to be an architect. I've never gone to like a Dreamforce and had someone like on the wall, it says architect and then a definition. I don't know what it means. I think it means the person who designs the solution, but not necessarily the person who builds the solution. But
Mhm.
no one's actually told me if that's the case. So you tell me, am I right?
I don't think we have a certain definition of architect, uh, but I think you're right.
Yeah. So let's go with that. The person who designs the solution but doesn't necessarily build it. So in this case, we'll say the person who designs but doesn't build. So imagine this is not necessarily a great analogy, but you're going to get married. You want to have a special cake. So you go to your baker and you say, hey, I want a cake that looks like this. For example, when I got married, I'm not married anymore, but when I was married, I got a cake that looked like a Pac-Man board. So it was black and it had like blue lanes for Pac-Man and it had a Pac-Man drawn on it, whatever. I was not involved in the process of actually making the cake. I didn't have the skill to know if the cake was done well or poorly. In the end, I just saw the cake and I was like, yeah, this is good. Tastes good, looks good. But if I was like the senior baker and I said, hey, okay, make a Pac-Man cake. And then they come back to me and I look at it and sure, maybe it looks like Pac-Man, but I can see the edges aren't smooth and the lines aren't straight and the consistency of the cake isn't good. Like, I'm just going to be mad. I'm just going to be upset that like I had this vision in my head of how to solve this problem. And sure, it solves the problem. The people are going to eat the cake. The people are going to pay for the cake. The people are going to be happy. But I look at it and I'm like, no, that's not good. And in coding, it's worse because code sticks around. It doesn't get eaten and then thrown away. With code, you get technical debt if someone builds something poorly. So when I design a solution, I'm going to use another story from my partner's old company. She was obviously given this code base. She didn't build all the code in it. She was trying to write a test. We spent a bunch of time working on some tests, and we found that her tests couldn't run because there were too many SQL queries happening, just in the test, not in the real running of the code. And so to understand what was going on, we would play around with the test. We whittled it down to like, all right, let's create one record for one object type. So we got to the point where we could create one very specific type of record and then look, and we could see that creating this one record caused 72 SOQL queries. Now, for the uninitiated, you're only allowed 100. In all of the processing of all of the code that happens in a single change to the database. So like when you're in a page layout and you click save, that save is making a change to the database. But in Salesforce, right, that can trigger off a million other things. You could have some rule that says, hey, when you save an opportunity, go update the account. And some other rule that says when you update an account, go add 5 contacts to it. And when you add a contact, go do this other stuff, right? So there can be this cascade of action. So in this code base, a very real code base for a very real company, you would make a single record and it would cause 72% of the allowed SOQL queries. Obviously, someone did not do a good job. Someone built something, and you know what? It could have even been that there were a bunch of different people involved, and maybe no one did a bad job, but collectively, when you put all of the pieces together, oh, well, if I do this little code and I use up 3 queries, no big deal, it's just 3. And in certain conditions, that cascades to do another 10, right? You end up with an impossible scenario. And so as someone, as the architect who builds the solution, I want to know that when it's coded, it doesn't just solve the problem, right? Of if I put in this value, it spits out this value. I want to know that it doesn't do it in a very bad way. And that's why I enjoy coding, because it's not just solving the problem, but it's solving the problem well. And I want to stop short of calling it art because I'm just not that douchey. But I have a certain amount of respect for the quality of the code and the efficiency of the code. And I think, I'm not the one who went to school for computer science. You did, right? So you understand data structures better than I do. You understand the power of n and log n and all of that stuff like better than I do because you studied it and I didn't really. So like you can do things very poorly or you can do things well, and there's a whole lot of room in between. And if you're not the person doing the code, or at least understanding the code for code review, you miss out on all of that beauty under the hood. And so yeah, I do enjoy the code. Sometimes it's a slog. You know what I don't like is dealing with Salesforce's bullshit. And there's a lot of bullshit from Salesforce. Like, for instance, here's a quick example. So the company I'm working at now uses person accounts. And so I haven't really used person accounts much in my history. Now I am. I'm very used to querying a table for accounts. And I use maybe I'm super old school here, but I use the dev console all the time. So I'll write a query in the dev console just to quickly see what's going on in my database. And I even will use the dev console to modify the database. Oh, especially when I'm testing things. Let's go in and change this record, right? Let me see what happens when I change this field on the account. Does my trigger do what it's supposed to do? And I can just do the whole thing from the dev console. Select ID and name from account. And I get everybody. I get all my person accounts. But if I try to change a field that's not the name, if I try to change like, I don't know, annual revenue, well, annual revenue wouldn't apply to a person account, but something relevant, like, I don't know, the mailing address. If I try to change the mailing address for my person account and my query started with select ID, name, it's going to be like, no, you can't do that. Sorry. And a lot of you are asking yourself, yeah, you can totally do that. No, you can't. If it's a person account record, you can query first name and you can query last name. But if you query name and then try to change the record, it's going to tell you to fuck right off. And that's just a recent example that I came across. It's just like annoying. So now I know. And so if I'm dealing with my person account records, I'm going to, choose first name and last name. And I'm not going to run into that problem much anymore. But there's all sorts of stupid crap developing for Salesforce that you're just like, oh, geez, I wrote all this code, and then you go to test it or run it for the first time, and you realize that it breaks because of some reason you didn't think about. And damn it, you have to figure out some other way around it. And so there are a lot of reasons that Salesforce sucks. There's a lot of reasons it's great. There's a lot of reasons, and so
And we still, yeah, and
go
we
ahead.
still have the limits for 20 years. I think we still have mostly the same limits, right? Even though the compute power now is so much greater than before. I think that Salesforce limits are also one of the, even though I never had like issues with limits, but still Salesforce has a lot of limitations, and there's, but it contributes to this, like solve the challenge.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. And that's when I get upset, right? When I don't enjoy it. Now, there's a certain amount of enjoyment overcoming, right? You figure it out and you're like, all right, cool, I got it. But it's really frustrating. And those are the parts that just, aren't great. But every job has that, whether you're a developer or a cake baker or whatever, right? There's going to be parts you don't enjoy. But if you don't enjoy like the core of your job, you shouldn't be doing that job. I mean, whatever, kudos to anybody who gets a job and gets paid so they can live their life, right? I'm not going to fault you for doing your job, but it's best. I think everyone would agree it's ideal to find a job that you actually enjoy doing. And so,
So I see. So if someone would give you like $1 billion, you would still continue coding.
uh, no, no. If I got a bunch of money, my goal is to not work. I would love to not work and experience the world because I don't think I've experienced enough. So no, I would rather not work, but I can tell you that I genuinely enjoy the work that I do. Right. I would probably rather be, on a jet ski than coding, but there's different levels of joy. And I can tell you, if I was given $1 billion and so I didn't need to work, but a friend came to me and said, hey, I need help doing this thing, I would rather, like, if it's something I can do, I would rather do it with them or for them, depending on the situation, than pay someone. Like, if money wasn't an object for me and I could just pay someone to build something for them, I would get real joy out of saying, all right, well, hey, let's do it. I mean, that's why I've taught Salesforce, right? Like, just yesterday, there was someone, so I'm still connected on the Slack community for the school that I went to, even though I was out like 8 years ago. And someone posted in Slack that they got laid off earlier in the year and they decided to learn Salesforce. I don't know why. I don't know what pointed them to Salesforce, but she decided to learn Salesforce and she just got a job, um, her first job after learning Salesforce. And it was for, in my opinion, not enough money. She's a Salesforce developer making very little relative to the market. And so I reached out to her. I was just like, hey, congratulations for getting a job. Getting a job, especially after getting laid off, is huge. Kudos to you. But I also see, no offense, you're kind of at the low end. If you'd like to take some time with me, I'd be happy to teach you all sorts of things, like help you put some Lightning Web Component projects together so that you can show them off, have a more shiny portfolio, help move up and maybe get a job that would pay you better. And I wouldn't have said that to people in most situations, but I found the salary that she posted she was making offensive. It was offensively low. And I don't have respect for whatever company it is that's paying her that little money to do the job. And that's why I reached out. I said, listen, you can just tell me to shut the hell up and get out of your face, mind my own business. I get it. But I'm also happy to help. And so I've taught all sorts of people with no compensation whatsoever because I just find it enjoyable to teach them and to know that some of the people I've taught, only a few, but some of the people I've taught are now working in Salesforce as a result of me teaching them. So now they have a career and their lives are better because I helped them through this part. It's a really good feeling. And that brings me joy. I don't know that it's altruism, but it's close and it feels nice.
Yeah, I definitely think there's insane joy for some reason, for in general, for humans to like kind of share the knowledge and help someone. And I totally get what you say, because I think 2 years ago I helped someone with the CV, and the guy got the job because he applied with the CV. I don't know, like of course he had a great CV, he just had to modify it a little bit, and I helped him. And then he wrote me a huge email out of 5 paragraphs. That made not only my day, that made my week. I was so, I don't know, it's just a crazy feeling to help, even though if you don't get any direct or material compensation out of it, still the feeling is awesome. And that goes back to this mental exercise that what would you do if you had like $1 billion granted to you? When I was working as a developer, my thought was immediately I would quit development. And what I'm doing now, I wouldn't quit it. So I think this is a big differentiator. Should you stay or should you go to other?
You know, hearing you say that makes me, I knew what you were getting at, because I would feel the same way. So I've been talking to a friend of mine about, I took a new job recently, but before taking that job, I was talking to some people about starting our own consultancy to do this stuff, which is, I think a lot of people go through that path. Hey, I've done Salesforce for long enough. Now I can just start my own business. So there's nothing novel there. But one thing that we wanted to do was start this company with the very express goal of bringing people into the Salesforce ecosystem and giving them a life. So I said that my previous coworker is very involved in the local Salesforce scene, and he's very, very passionate, as am I, but him even more so, very passionate about introducing people to Salesforce to give them a better life. And he's mentored several people. His sister just got her first job as a Salesforce administrator sometime this year, I believe. And she's making more money than she's ever made before because he helped her through this process of learning and becoming valuable to some company that now is very happy they hired her on. And that's just one example of many for him. That is something we wanted to do within a company. So the idea was that we would start this company and I'm a senior developer. I know what I'm doing. He's a senior admin. He knows what he's doing. I have access to this school that I came out of. Every 7 weeks, they're pumping out new graduates. So I would have access to hey, does anybody want to, you're a junior. I know you know how to code, the fundamentals of code, right? You just learned. So let me help you translate that into Salesforce. And I can act as sort of the guidance for how to build these things. I would become the architect. I would take the stakeholder stuff. I would then work with the developers. And then over time, we would have people who, are experienced. And then we bring on more juniors and they can train those juniors and I can train them. But the goal from the outset was start a company that brings people who aren't in here, aren't in this system, and train them to become better. And we even wanted to have a very specific system in place. And maybe this isn't unique, but to just be hey, we want you to come on board, and any one of our clients, if they want to hire you full time, that's part of our offering. We're going to have someone work on your project. If you want to hire them full time, you can take them away, give them a job, and then we'll just repeat that cycle. I don't know how effective it would be, and I'm sure plenty of people could tell me why that wouldn't work. But that was a thought of ours. So if I suddenly got a lot of money, it would be interesting to actually start that up to help other people, right? Because I'd take more vacations than I do now, but I think I would want to give back to the world and help other people succeed rather than just, sitting on a beach in Greece for the rest of my life.
Why did you end up not starting?
Nothing is too personal for me. It's viability is an issue. One of the reasons we started talking about this is because I was in a really interesting situation where I was in touch with an old boss of mine, actually the boss from my first company. I was in touch with him, and he had an outstanding contract with a company that was looking for a Salesforce developer by contract. I had actually received a job, not a job offer, right? But as a Salesforce developer, you probably get people beating down your door for jobs every day or every week at least. So someone's like, hey, do you want to work for this company on contract doing Salesforce development? And I knew that that's where my old boss worked as a consultant. And he was fronting the whole new Salesforce implementation there. So I was like, hey, is this you? And he's like, no, I actually left that company recently. And here's the kicker. It's like, but I still have $1 million contract with them as a consultant to provide, talent if I want. He's like, if you want that job, just go through me. I'll give you 100% of the pay, but you won't be going through, this other recruitment company. So if you're a consultant, I'm talking to your listeners. If you're a consultant, the consulting company will bill you out at whatever. Let's say for a good developer, $250, at least in the US, $250 an hour. But you, as the employee, would be lucky to see $100 an hour out of that contract. But my old boss was like, just go through me, and you can have all of it. So I could be billing myself out for $250 an hour, which is insane money. If you're actually working full time at $250 an hour, that's $500 grand a year. I was like, hey, that would be a great way to start up a consultancy. And he's like, yeah, he said, you can go through me, or if you want, we can just start our own company and you can get all the money for this contract. And he has all sorts of contacts, so he he was talking about how he could get more work after that. And I had my, admin buddy working at the same company as me at the time. And it's like, yeah, let's come on. You can do the admin work. I can do the development work. If we need more people, I can bring people on. And the thing that made it real was that we had a very real contract in front of us. We wouldn't have to look for work. That made it very appealing, because getting your first job and having your first experience is the hardest piece of it. The reason I didn't pursue that, honestly, was because the company I was at gave me equity, and I was constantly vesting equity, and I didn't want to lose that. I ended up leaving that company anyway, a while later, probably about a year later. So eventually I did give up some of that equity. But it was after that other opportunity had gone. And, I'm super scared of starting my own company because there's a bunch of reasons you don't want to do it as well. It's scary. The idea is still in my head, and I would still love to do it if I could really feel comfortable with it. But, this is not a Salesforce talk, but starting a new company, the people who are successful are the ones who don't think. They just do. Like, hey, I'm going to start this company because I think, I don't know, I make good cupcakes. I'm going to start the company. And they make good cupcakes and people buy them. And it's because they didn't think about, oh, what are the costs? What's the ROI on this? How many cupcakes am I going to have to sell before I become, before I break even? Like, if you don't think about it, you're much more likely to jump in. But I'm far too analytical. And so there's a much bigger hurdle for my brain to start my own company because I think of all of the ways it could fail. But all of those fools who go out there and start companies, they're actually way better. They were way smarter than me because they didn't worry. They just went for it and they made it work. And I'm the fool.
So I went from working as a developer to being self-employed, basically starting a business, at least trying to start a business, around 2.5, so on the 1st of September. And it's been the most difficult decision in my life. I spent more than a year trying to make this decision, and I just had so much fear, and it was so difficult to do this decision. That it's crazy. So that's why I asked, why didn't you start? And I think it's incredibly difficult. So even though, I was born in Ukraine, and then I learned German, and I went studying in Germany, completely different country, no idea about the country, barely speaking the language. And that decision was not that difficult as leaving the job, even though I had already clients and I already was taking some money. So that's incredible how difficult it is, this decision from going from being employed to being self-employed or starting a company. Definitely very difficult. For me, at least, was super difficult.
Yeah. And now let me criticize what you just said there a little bit. So you started a company and it was really hard, but am I right to understand that the company you started was to teach people Salesforce?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So for your company, building that, there are essentially zero capital expenses, right? Like there's no cost. You just have to get the client and they pay you over Zoom or something. Like you could be teaching me
Yeah.
right now. And I think the only expense you have is whatever for this podcasting software we're using right now, probably spend $20 a month or something. So like there's no cost. And other people, like I was saying, people who just start a cupcake company, like there are very real costs. You got to have,
Mhm.
maybe you don't have the oven, right? You got to buy the oven and the ingredients and all of the materials needed to make the stuff. Your company is a brain company. You're like a lawyer, right? Any lawyer can hang their shingle up and start doing their work. It took a lot to get there. They had to study hard. They needed to learn their craft, but 100% of your assets are in your head. And so starting that company is, relatively speaking, easy. Yet the reality is it was still super hard for you. And I don't mean to disrespect that. I completely respect it. The hardest part, I'm sure, was just leaving the security of your existing job. So I have a ton of
Yeah.
questions for you. I told you this is going to turn into an interview for you. So you're teaching Salesforce now. That is what you do, what you claim as your career. So what does that look like? And for anyone listening, this was not the intent. Igor didn't know I was going to do this, right? but this is going to turn into a pitch for his business right now. So if you want to learn Salesforce, talk to Igor. So what does it entail? Like if someone comes to you and says, I want to learn Salesforce, like do you have different packages where you tell them I can work with you for 3 hours a week for 10 weeks, or do you just like give them a training material? Like what is it?
I have so now the pressure on me, right, to pitch my business. I have two different programs. The first program is for complete beginners that have no idea about coding. So like what is the variable, what is the method, what is the class, object, and so on. I had so far one run of the cohort based course. So I don't really believe in learning coding through YouTube or Udemy. So I have zero Udemy, zero YouTube courses. I teach in live and with one-to-one mentoring with people, because going back to what you said, I strongly believe in one-to-one mentoring with people. And this is my first program. So you go in 12 weeks from having no idea to having some idea about Apex, learning variables and methods and lists, collections, and so on. We end up by triggers. So we don't go in 12 weeks through triggers, cubles, batch, as a lot of different programs do. We don't do that. We focus on the basics. And my idea that after the 12 weeks, I want to develop to some degree this algorithmic thinking with people. Because when you learn how to code, it's you need to break your brain into thinking as developer. So the concept of variable or the concept of loop, as you said, it doesn't exist in the real world. You don't have these concepts. So you have to learn these completely new concepts, and it takes time. And it doesn't really matter in what programming language you do it. I do it in Apex because that's where I'm good at. So I have a program with more than 100 different tasks. It consists out of theory. So I do the lecture, then the students get the homework, and then they solve the homework, they submit the solution, they get the feedback, they get one-to-one with me every week. And like this, we move for 12 weeks. And at the end, now the next week is the last week of my first cohort. So I'm very excited about that. This is the last week, so I'm finishing the first cohort. Let's see when I'm gonna run the next cohort. Let's see. So this is my beginner program, and then there's advanced program. Advanced program is project based learning. So over the course of around 20 homeworks, so it depends how much time it takes. I don't do the advanced program in courses in cohorts. I do it only one-to-one teaching, because everyone needs own time. There are people who finish like in 3 months. There are people who finish in 8 months the program. um, and the advanced program, it consists out of real world projects. So like you build a project that was actually once way back, kind of course you cannot see it, of course it's very very different, but it was kind of the idea behind the project that I had once. So this is how I teach.
Yeah. So I would find it much more difficult to do the first thing where you're actually teaching development from the start. I mean, when I say difficult, I just mean like it's a lot more time consuming because there's so much more concept in there. I've had the luxury of when I was teaching people Salesforce, it was people who just went through like 6 or 7 month course of learning development to all sorts of degrees. Like they learn the basics. They also learn like how to integrate with external systems. They, make APIs. They've done a lot by the time I came to them. And so I was just teaching them how to translate that knowledge into Salesforce. And because Salesforce, one of the benefits of working in Salesforce as a developer is that, once you know it, you can go to any company and almost immediately be effective because the data model, obviously every company is going to have their own custom data model, but Salesforce has its own standard data model that's, it's the word standard for a reason. It's the same every company you go to. So like accounts, opportunities, contacts, and leads, and reporting, and all of that stuff. So like that's why it's easy. So first of all, Salesforce is an easy language. For those who don't know, like it's got its own programming language and it's got its own querying language to the database, and those two things like work very intimately together. They're very coupled because Salesforce, all you're ever doing is reading or writing to the database. Like that's true of probably all coding, but it's especially true in Salesforce where you're not going to do anything if you're not going to be changing the database as a result. It's super easy though. Like there's this, you've probably heard of SQL. Salesforce uses SQL, and it's like a super dumbed down kindergarten kiddie version of SQL, super easy to learn. And Apex is like the bare bones of object oriented development, right? Like I learned Ruby at the school that I went to, and it can do all sorts of cool stuff that you can't do in Apex. But once you accept that Apex is very primitive, it's essentially, by the way, Java. You know this, of course. It's super simple. Like you can't do a lot with it. There's just not a lot of things built into it directly. You can ultimately you can do a lot with it, but I mean like JavaScript has a million different special string methods and looping methods and whatever, and like none of that exists in Apex. So it's really easy to learn because you learn some basics and that's it. Everything else is built on those fundamental basics that you can then go build on your own if you want. Teaching from the ground up, if someone who doesn't know code at all, it's just like a whole lot more work and not necessarily relevant to Salesforce. But the Salesforce piece, that's what I did. And so when I taught, it was 4 weeks. I think I would do like 2 nights a week for 3 hours a piece. So it ended up being like 20 to 25 hours. And it was project based, like you said. I mean, I would teach a little bit, but I would always have them actually doing something. And I didn't do this very much when I was teaching in a classroom, but like I never had homework because I knew that people wouldn't do it. I think homework is super valuable, and I wish I could get people to do the homework. So if I were to do it again, I would probably lean a little bit more into homework than I have. But I would love to give a problem and then have the class show off their solution, right? Like, all right, Jimmy did it this way, Susie did it this way, Tim did it this other way. What do you think is best? Right? Because there's a bunch of different ways to solve the problem. And the class can all come to some consensus. Like we like this one solution better than all of the rest. And then we could talk about why. Why it's more efficient in this way. It's easier to understand. Maybe it's better laid out, the actual thinking. I don't know. The classroom environment with multiple people, well, classroom, I mean, it could be like 2 or 3 people. There's definitely a benefit, I think, to having multiple people involved so you can learn from the collective knowledge of the group and almost more importantly, from the collective mistakes of the group. And so you say you only do one-on-one. I think that's great. And I do a bunch of one-on-one with people these days. But if you ever have the opportunity where you have multiple people, maybe it's not so crazy to be like, hey, do you want to do this together? And structured. So every week we meet. And that also puts some more like push in them, like, hey, you're going to have to do this homework before the next time we meet. So obviously you come up with a time frame that works for everybody, but at least then they have a deadline. One of the things I think that kills people in self-learning is the lack of deadlines. I'm sure I'm not the only person who believes this, but if I don't have a time that I must finish something, I will never finish something. And so having a structured class to say, okay, we're going to meet in 2 weeks, and this is where I would like you to be. Maybe you won't get here. Maybe you won't solve the problem that I want you to solve, but I want you to try. And your goal is to get this far. And feel free to message me during the week to help you get to that goal. But if not, we'll reconvene. So that's how I would do it when I was teaching in a classroom or a group Zoom session. But anyway, I'm just babbling again. I'm really proud of you for doing this. This is great. I don't know how you find people to teach. I don't know how you advertise yourself. This podcast, I suppose, is one way.
This podcast is actually, so I'm only a few episodes in, so this podcast is not really about that much, because I don't think that many people will listen to this podcast. What I think, I'm not really sure what I exactly want out of this podcast. Like the way I find people is with LinkedIn. I have quite an active following on LinkedIn, and that's how I found so far all the people. So if you're active on LinkedIn, I think it's very hard to miss me there in my posts. Yeah, I think that this teaching stuff, it's one of those things that look easy from outside, from people like who just observe it, right? Like, so well, you're a developer, you can like go and teach, but then you see those things like, okay, if I teach in the group, I see a few people fall off because they have own pace. When I teach one-to-one, I see that some people have the problems with accountability. When I have a group, I see that. When I have a smaller group, that's one thing. When I have a bigger group, that's nothing. So this teaching thing is actually quite difficult, and I'm still figuring it out. I have these two programs, but I think that at the end I will need to decide for which program I want to focus on. Um, because it takes a lot of repetition, it takes a lot of time to get good at something. So I totally understand what you say with teaching people who have no coding knowledge. It's kind of difficult, especially because a lot of people, they don't know they actually want to go this path, so they kind of tried a little bit of coding, but they're not really sure, versus people who already have the coding skills. You already know that they are in, you just need to teach them how to do it in Salesforce. Yeah, so there's a lot of things. I'm very into this teaching stuff, and I'm still trying to figure out the best way to teach for people. um, so far I tried a lot of stuff. Everything has own trade-offs and own problems.
Yeah, it's always a learning process for you, right? I would constantly be adjusting based on how my last class, responded to certain thing. So I would try to adjust and come up with better teaching methods to teach a certain concept or change the project that we worked on. Let me ask you, let's say you were encountering someone who, is that the second one. They already know how to code. They might not be an expert, right? But they know the basics of coding. You want to teach them Salesforce. If you were to give them sort of one starter project, and I know the answer for myself if I'm asking myself this question, but what is your like starter project to learn whatever it is you want to teach them in Salesforce?
It's a great question. So first of all, it depends how much time this person had and how much resources they want to invest into it, because there's a lot that you can learn, right? So I think the project that I have, for example, for project-based learning is, it involves all the parts. So it involves the two main emphasis that I take are integrations, and actually three: integration, triggers, and LWC. And especially I like the combination between integrations and LWC, because it gives you the whole business process understanding. Because usually the business process in Salesforce, it starts on the front end and then it goes into the backend logic somehow, right? So in a lot of cases, as a Salesforce developer, we don't really have this differentiation between front end Salesforce developer and back end Salesforce developer, which a lot of people do, right? So if you're a Java developer, you're back end developer. And if you're a React developer, you're a front-end developer. So usually in Salesforce, you're a full stack developer all the time. And the reason for that is because you have this business process that starts with the user clicking something or having some kind of interface, and goes into either integrating with another systems or performing some kind of backend logic. So I think that the projects that people should do are kind of that take the full cycle of a certain business project. Now, if I were a person who was sitting alone, was thinking about what project should I do, I would think more in the direction of kind of startup or solving a real business problem. This is something I think that was the way I learned. I developed projects that I thought will be solving like real business challenges and real business problems. And then I was invested in those problems. Like, for example, one of the projects that I built in the university was training for German language, where you have to fill out the blanks in the sentences. I was very proud of this because I could use this project for teaching German to my sister. She was learning German back then. And I think those are type of the projects that I would rather think that people should solve, not in terms of the topics, rather like take a project that you think will solve some real problem, and then see that this project is also kind of technically not very basic. It's not like a to-do list or like some simple trigger. See that it involves some kind of integration or something more sophisticated. That would be my answer.
Yeah. So when I had the classroom environment and I was teaching people, over the course of a few weeks, I did actually have an integration just with it. We were basically building a shopping cart and having a credit card processing built in. But since then, I've stepped away from integrations. It's not that I don't think they're useful, but oftentimes integrations are just to be moving data between systems. And, we've got a lot more middleware these days. I've found myself leaning into Lightning Web Components a lot as what I teach people in Salesforce now. So I'm not like, when I asked you what your first project would be, I think we had different scopes in our head. Like I'm thinking of just like, what's a small thing, a simple Lightning Web Component you could build that would give you a nice introduction to how to build this sort of stuff. And I'll describe mine in a second. But yeah, like when I've got these people who know how to code but don't know Salesforce, I think to myself like, okay, I want to introduce you to the querying system of SOCL. I want to introduce you to Apex. I want to introduce you to Lightning Web Component because that's, everybody's in Lightning now. I, for the record, hate JavaScript and like the Lightning Web Component. Like it took me a very long time to be willing to and comfortable in the world of Lightning Web Components because a
We are on the
non-typed
same page here.
language, yeah, like a lot of people out there love JavaScript because it's what they learn in. But when it comes to actually like building things for real in the real world, JavaScript is trash. It doesn't compile. You can't tell when there are errors. If something goes wrong, you just get a white screen. Like, there's so much to hate about it. There's also things that I love, like when I'm actually building in it that I start enjoying, but there's just so much to hate. And so I've found that a lot of the people that I've taught, so the school that I come from has a back-end program and a front-end program. So you do one or the other. When I did it, it was long enough ago that they only had a back-end. There was no front-end, but now there's both. And a lot of the people that would end up in my class were front-end people. So we had a different learning experience. They were much more comfortable with JavaScript. But I've also looked at other components that have been built out in the world, and there seems to be this resistance to do anything in Apex when building your Lightning Web Components. And part of that is because the documentation for Lightning Web Components steers you so much towards like wires and building stuff only using like their JavaScript solutions to pull stuff from the database. And anytime you do that, like it's so hard. This isn't meant to be a lesson right now. That's not why we're talking, but like everything about Lightning Web Components that don't use Apex, I just hate it. It's incredibly verbose and hard to understand and hard to use in my opinion. But if you just like pull the data from Apex, it just becomes so much easier. And I've decided there's this middle ground. When I say I've decided that a good Lightning Web Component developer, and this is my opinion without much exposure to other scenarios, is that a good Lightning Web Component developer appreciates the power and value of what you can do in Apex, coupled with the JavaScript controller, and does not lean too much into either one or the other. They really have to understand the balance of the two and make some decisions about how they use the Apex part and how they use the JavaScript part. And I know how I feel on that subject, and I could go into it, but I'm not going to. Anyway, that's why when I teach, I try to express like, okay, you can do this on the front end, you can do this part on the back end. And so I said I would talk about the project, the idea that I always have the sort of my go-to in teaching people Salesforce. It's very simple. So I had this desire once at my job to put like a warning on the screen. Let's imagine a scenario of where the annual revenue for an account is very high. Let's say over, I don't know, $10 million. And in the case of an account in Lightning that is over $10 million annual revenue, you want a big colorful banner across the screen saying, hey, this is a big account. There's a couple ways to do that, right? Like you could use a formula field that references an image and a static resource, and it puts some image on the screen. All right, that's an old school way to do it. You could do it that way. I think I've only ever done that like once at some company. And it was just because they already did that, and I was just like adjusting the image or something. In Lightning, standard component, there's a rich text component. So you could put that on the screen. But for whatever reason, rich text component does not allow you to set the background color. It only allows you to set the color of the font itself, of the text. So you can make it bold and red or pink or whatever, right? But it would still be on a white background. And I was like, I want a banner. I want a big colorful banner. By the way, I very recently, like 2 weeks ago, learned that there is actually a way to do this, which is like super hacky. And I learned about it on Unofficial Salesforce from a post that the Unofficial Salesforce guy made in Reddit. So it can be done, but it has very specific uses and is a little bit weird. So, so the Lightning Web Component that I tell people to build is I want to be able to make a colorful banner on the screen. I want someone to be able to put this banner, set the text, set the background color, set the color of the text, set the size of the text. If you want to go crazy, set the alignment of the text, left, right, center. And so I built this tool myself and I modified it several times. If people, by the way, listening to this are interested, you can go to my GitHub, which maybe you'll post in the podcast notes or something.
I will, yeah.
Yeah. So I have this up for people to use. It's called Dynamic Banner. The next step that I took with it, which is where it becomes really interesting, is that it can, the rich text component that's standard cannot post data from the record, right? So let's say I want to say, hey, this is a really big account. Its annual revenue is $10,005. I can't do that because although I could write $10,005 into the component, it doesn't actually read from the record to put the record's value on there. So every account that has that warning would say $10,005 on it, even though the annual revenue is whatever it happens to be. So my banner can also display values from the record or from any record in the parenting chain. So if you're on an opportunity, you can post information about the account or about the account's creator or about the account's creator's manager's, created date or something, right? So it can do that and it can make it colorful. If you want, you can put no text in it and then you just have a big colorful thing on the screen to act as a visual separator. It can do a bunch of, a couple other things too. There's a couple other tricks up the sleeves. But the point here is that it's a very simple project that has very real value. And every company, you'd be like, hey, I just want to be able to put colorful blocks on the screen and separate things. I want to be able to put some information, some warnings on the screen or something. And you can make some decisions based on visibility filters, whether or not they show up. That's already built into Salesforce. So it's this very simple project for someone who's never seen a Lightning Web Component to go into and say, hey, here's something I could build and I could show it off to a prospective employer. Be like, I built this thing. It's super useful. It's easy, right? I could walk you through all the parts of how it works. It's very easy, but it's also very useful. And I think that is like, if you can find something that is both easy and useful and universal in its usability, then you've found something really valuable. And so that's where I go. That's my first go-to project. And then from there, you could do all sorts of other stuff. Like, let's actually work with records. Let's make something that, helps do something in bulk that you can't normally do or whatever. You didn't ask, but I told you that's my project. Go find it on my GitHub or build it yourself.
That's cool. I will link the GitHub in the description. That's for sure. Yeah, I think so. I am kind of out of my questions. I think we had a really, really good talk. I enjoyed it so much. The last few questions though.
Yeah.
What advice can you give to people who just start with learning Salesforce that already have some programming knowledge?
So do that project I just described. That's one. If you already have programming knowledge and you have an interest in getting into Salesforce, the difficult reality is that almost nobody will hire a junior Salesforce developer. Like I very rarely see postings for junior. Everybody has an important business problem. They want to get it fixed. They want to get someone who knows what they're doing. They're already paying $1 million to use Salesforce every year. They want to get someone who's experienced in. At least that's been my observation. So it is difficult to get your foot in the door. And I consider myself extremely lucky to have fallen into it by accident the way that I did. So if you're going to get in, you've got to have something to show off. And I hate interviewing. Interviewing, I think everybody probably hates, but being the interviewer sucks. Being the interviewee also sucks. And I have taken it upon myself to steer interviews where I've been the interviewee in this way. So I'm going to get around to answering your question, by the way, but in a roundabout way. A couple companies ago, when I was working at this company and I was asked to build a survey that solved a very specific problem. The company wanted to survey internal employees, have them answer some questions, and then, report on that data. And I was like, that's cool, we could do that. And it seems like we've done that before at this company, but every time we build a survey for you, the admin has to do it. They have to build a new object. Like, why am I building a fresh data table where every field is one of your questions? That seems super inefficient. Like, why don't I just build a survey tool? So I built an entire survey tool that someone with no admin access can generate surveys, present the surveys to the users. All the answers get recorded. Then I built a whole custom reporting solution for it. Like, it was a really big project by my standards anyway. And that project was universal. It could be used in any org. So I put it over into my personal development org. And when I went to an interview with some other company, I was like, hey, at the start of this interview, I just want to tell you, I get it. Like, interviewing's difficult for everybody. You probably have a lot of questions you want to ask me, blah, blah, blah. How did I deal with some really difficult situation with a coworker? Or we could do like some technical whiteboarding or something. But if you want, I've built some cool stuff. Like, why don't I just walk you through something I built? I'll show you this tool, why I think it's useful, talk about the problem that it solves. And then if you're into it, I can show you all the code, and I can talk to how I built all of this, the data model and the visual layer. It was Visualforce back in the day, what I built. And if you go into an interview where you are confident and you have something to show off, that will just, at least my belief is that it would just do tons. It would, first of all, make people see that you're comfortable. And by the way, getting a job in any industry, regardless of what it is, if the people like you, you're so much more likely to get the job. They don't care if you're good at your job. They care if they like you. And they will like you if you're good at the job, but also if you're a good communicator. And so confidence and comfort are invaluable when it comes to actually getting a job. So if you build something that, like I said, solves a problem and is applicable to the company you're talking to, which means universally available since you don't know what company you're going to talk to. So you can build something that would be useful anywhere, and you know every inch about it, about how it works, and you can walk them through all the parts. And someone who's not experienced in code, as well as someone who is experienced in code, will get something out of that discussion. Then you can guide the conversation and make sure that you're showing off only the best of you. So build the project I talked about, or some other project that you can think of, or that Igor suggests to you, or I don't know, I probably have a bunch of different projects that I could build. A few of them are on my GitHub. Build it, have it ready in a dev org. And then when you go into your interview, you asked me, what's my advice? I think the real question is, like, the real goal, everybody's real goal is, how do I get a job? At least in the context of our discussion here. How do I get the job? So my advice is leaning towards how to actually succeed in the interview. So you build a thing that you can show off, you guide the conversation and have confidence the whole time, and you are ready to show off every single piece of that. And you perhaps also have two different versions of your speech, right? You have the version towards the person who doesn't know code, because inevitably you'll be talking to like the code-free people. But like, hey, have you ever just wanted to do this in your org? Well, look, you can just drag and drop it here, and then you add a few variables into the admin panel. You're never looking at code. You're never opening up VS Code. There's like, here, look, I added this thing in there. And if there's any other features you want, I bet I could build them. And next time we talk in a week, I could have a fresh new version for you and prove that I know what I'm doing. And then there's the code people who would want you to do some whiteboard challenge and talk about how to build a trigger or something. You can be like, hey, let me walk you through the code. And that is my greatest advice for getting the job. There's a bunch more to it, like how do you make the contacts? How do you even get into the room to talk to these people? Like, that's a whole other discussion of, you'd have better talk for this, how to connect with people on LinkedIn and make friends in the industry. But assuming you can get into that room, you have a really big hurdle of proving to them that you're not an asshole and that you know what you're doing. And so you need to be ready for that. And I think the best way to do that is to come prepared with your own content instead of responding to theirs. I've never had to do a technical interview in my life. I think that's not true. I think I interviewed for a company and they asked me like one technical question about trigger stuff. And I was like, oh, that's easy. Like, I do that with every class. I teach them exactly this. And then I fucked up and I forgot a key piece of it. But I think that was one interview where I showed them, like, here's the survey tool I built. Let me just walk you through it. And they were like, yeah, you're great. You know what you're doing. They didn't hire me. I don't know why. I think I was too expensive or something. But I felt comfortable that they appreciated that I knew what I was doing. And And that's the key. If you can prove you know what you're doing and that you are going to be a friend, like someone they can actually talk to at work, like a human being, that'll get you very, very far in the interview. And at that point, it's just a question of, did someone else do it better?
I think these are awesome advices for someone who starts. If people want to connect with you, where should they go? Or do you actually want to have people connecting with you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you want me to teach you Salesforce, I can do it at a cut rate under Igor. Not really. Go to Igor for classes, but I think I'm on LinkedIn, right? I mean, we're linked. I never even know what my LinkedIn name is. Is it my full name? Is it my username on the internet? That's my full name. All right, so you'll link to it
Your full
somewhere.
name.
But my name is Alon Waisman with a weird spelling, so I'm not going to spell it. But you can find me on LinkedIn. There's the GitHub, which has some of my code on it if you want to look at it. I think I'm on Twitter too. I basically don't use social media. I told you I started my career, my adult career, doing social media, and the result of that is that I don't use it in my real life. But there's that. You know what? You know what I never mentioned? I'm just going to give myself a pat on the back. I was some people. If you went to Dreamforce, did you go to Dreamforce, by the way?
No, I didn't. It's too far
Okay.
away from Germany.
Yeah, it's pretty far away. But you probably know that at Trailhead DX a year ago, yeah, it was at Trailhead. They announced integration users, free integration users in Salesforce. Do you remember this?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was me. I was at Dreamforce and I was like, hey, people who run Salesforce, it's stupid that we don't have integration users for this and this and this reason. And they're like, hey, you're right, we could totally do that. And so they invited me back to get on stage with them when they announced it 6 months later at Trailhead DX. So if you were at Salesforce and you saw that guy do that thing, that was me. It doesn't help you contact me, but that was me. It's my claim to fame in Salesforce that I'll probably hold on to for the rest of my life. But yeah, LinkedIn, connect with me there if you want.
This is awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining.
You are welcome.